Is there conflict between science and the Christian faith? If you ask the average person on the street, they very well could say yes, that science and Christianity are at odds with each other. But is that really the case? I'm joined today by Barrie Winn, who is a chemical engineer and a Christian, to help answer that question. Barrie, what would you say to somebody that says there's conflict between science and Christianity?
Well, I've heard people say that, of course, and one of my first responses would be, well, can you give me any specific conflicts? And often people don't necessarily have one at the top of their head. It's almost a secondhand idea that they've picked up from their friends or culture around them and hadn't really thought in detail about a specific conflict. Other people may have an issue that bothers them. And if I can answer it, then I'll give my best answer. If I can't answer it, I will try to go away and think about it or ask other believers what they think about the question, but try to, respect people's genuine concerns. But I personally have found that my Christian faith is strengthened by the study of science. And I think it's always important to point out two really important things that non-scientists who may have this view may not have even thought about. Now, the first is that a major assumption in the scientific enterprise is that there is order in the universe. There are fixed laws. In fact, the prophet Jeremiah spoke about the fixed laws of heaven and earth that will not change. And it was some of the great pioneers of science, people like Newton and Kepler, who were informed by this understanding, and it gave them great success in their endeavors because they were determined to find these fixed laws. And they found many and advanced our knowledge of science greatly.
So this is really, I think an interesting and important point, because really what you're saying here is that the Christian worldview, which is informed by Scripture, is actually laying certain foundations that are necessary to build the edifice of science.
Yes, absolutely. There are other aspects of the biblical worldview which are important to science. One is, for example, the fact that time is linear. There are other worldviews that see time as somewhat cyclical. The circle of life, you will. And it's just cyclical. Whereas the Hebrew text, which, and of course now the Christian text, tell us there was a beginning, that history is progressing, and there's going to be a conclusion. And the whole idea of being able to plot parameters as a function of time, of course, it's all part of modern science. But that linear understanding of time, I think, was a part of the biblical worldview. And there's some other examples you can give, but that's one that I find particularly intriguing.
Now, how has your faith as a Christian informed or impacted your work as a chemical engineer?
Well, I'll be glad to answer that, but I want to give you the second thing that I'd like to tell people is that science opens up a lot of evidence for the existence of God, whether it be looking through a telescope. Astronomers over the last century have proven quite conclusively there was a beginning. So that was science looking at the macro scale. But scientists looking at the micro scale, looking through their microscopes, see incredible evidence of molecular machines, which are very reminiscent of the kind of machines that humans build. So what we see at the cellular level looks very much like the product of a mind. So that's the second point I would make about science. Now, science has definitely, or my Christian faith has definitely impacted my work as a chemical engineer. And I say in three areas. One, and this applies to all Christians, in the book of Colossians, or his letter of Colossians, Paul wrote in chapter 3, verses 23 to 25, that whatever your job is, do it heartily as unto the Lord. Mm-hmm. And remember, you're serving him ultimately. And that means working with enthusiasm, working with integrity. And that ought to be a hallmark, those ought to be hallmarks for all Christians, I believe, in the workplace. The second thing is, as Christians, we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that has huge implications in the workplace. First of all, treating people with respect, having a respectful conversation, but also other things that may not be immediately apparent, such as safety. Mm-hmm. I worked in a very large, complicated chemical complex that had a lot of hazards. Well, it was important to ensure that we did that work safely. So, and that as a Christian, that informed my holding very high value to safety, but also safety in transporting our products to the end customer. It's important it has to be done safely, and it was important that our products be safe and used appropriately. So all that really is part of loving your neighbor as yourself. And I think the third way which informed my work is relating to being a good steward of the resources God gives us. I was involved in the recovery of mining and the processing of phosphates. And that's a very valuable resource. And so the things that were important is that from a Christian is, of course, make good use of that resource. Don't waste it. In fact, it's interesting. Jesus, when he did his miracles, feeding the 5,000 and then feeding the 4,000, he made sure that his disciples collected all the leftovers. They weren't just thrown away on the hillside, or wasted. They were collected. And that's a very important lesson. God gives us these resources, food being one of the most important resources. We shouldn't waste them. And we should, as stewards of resources, we need to make sure we take good care of them. Also, it's important that we not damage other resources. For example, when you're mining and processing a mineral, you've got to be careful not, if you don't do it properly, you can damage other resources like water or air quality or the land quality. So that's very important. I think that's informed by Christian worldview, that you need to make good use of your resource without damaging other resources.
So this is, really interesting because there's a theme that's kind of emerging here.
Yes.
And that's really the power of the Christian worldview, because not only is it laying the foundation for science, but it's providing a framework for ethics that are really critical for the success of any kind of work in science and engineering.
Yes.
If science and engineering proceeds without ethics, then people are going to fudge results.
Absolutely.
And that can actually have devastating consequences that can stultify science. So the Christian worldview is providing that ethical framework, but also environmentalism is very much an idea that's intertwined with the Christian worldview.
Yes, I agree. And the Christian worldview, I think, is something which requires us to reflect on what Scripture teaches us, because often everybody has a worldview, they have a way of interpreting reality, understanding reality, and then living out our understanding. And living in Western culture, we may unconsciously adopt worldviews that are alien to the Christian worldview. We might just adopt some aspects of naturalism without thinking about it. So I think it's important for us to reflect on what a biblical worldview is and learn how to articulate it and then live it out. And I think one of the most compelling things about the Christian worldview is that if you look at comparison of different worldviews, gives the best explanation for reality. And that's a topic we could talk at more length on another occasion, I'm sure, but it's very compelling.